Hi, I'm Louise, this is Foxes and Fairy Tales, and this is my last vlog for Mystery and Mayhem. So as we're going into this kind of last week of the readathon, I have some goals, some reading I would like to get done. My first priority is to finish my Weird and Wonder read-along of Ship of Magic. I've been kind of recording my thoughts on this as I went. It's such a big book. It's about 900 pages in my copy. I tried the audiobook and the audiobook just wasn't working for me, so I switched to the physical copy, which has went a lot better, but it's still been pretty slow going. So what I'm going to do is move all of my discussion of that book right to the end of the vlog, and I'll stick a timestamp if you're interested in jumping to that. Other than that, my first book of this week is going to be Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. It is a really sunny day today, and I don't know if you'll be able to see that because it's a library book. The reflection might be too much. Same with the glasses, I apologise. But The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. We'll get points for the person on the cover, but not the red cover. I'll just stick a picture here instead. I've been wanting to read this book for so long, and I've actually had it out the library before, and I don't know why I haven't picked it up. I think maybe I've been intimidated. I've heard it's a political fantasy and that it's quite densely written, and I don't know whether that's put me off. The cover has a kind of Game of Thronesy look to it, and I hate to say, but it is by a male author, and those two things, that kind of fantasy by a male author, I don't know, maybe I'm expecting it to be a little bit dry or a little bit the women are all two-dimensional and there are no queer people. I could be pleasantly surprised. But the thing is, I also think I'm going to really love it because it's supposedly about a kind of investigator going through these worlds, and that, you know, the role of an investigator in a fantasy world is my jam. I have really high hopes for it, so I need to bite the bullet and read this one because I do think it could be a new favourite. Then, as well as finishing Ship of Magic, I have a handful of arcs I would like to get to this week. Things that are all due up either, I think they're all due for review very early in June. Reached the end of The Justice of Kings and I am really happy with how it turned out. Right at the start, I thought this was going to be a book where I would enjoy it to a kind of middling point, but think that it was one that I would get a lot more from on reread. And I'm happy to say that both has and hasn't been true. I do think I'm going to get more from this book when I reread it. That section at the beginning had an awful lot of world building, an awful lot of names, a lot of discussion of the different regions within this empire, and there was a lot to take in that I am not sure I fully grasped as the book was going along. Now, having read it, all of that is a lot more settled in my head, and I think if I were to go back, I wouldn't feel I was struggling so much with those earlier chapters, and therefore I would enjoy them more, and thus the whole book overall I would enjoy more. However, I don't think it was middling. I definitely had a great time with this one, and I probably would rate it somewhere around a 4. I absolutely want to continue the series. It's been a really nice mashup of the kind of murder mystery, not so much a cozy or a thriller, but maybe something like a kind of noir, and the classic epic fantasy world. It's a little bit like we're having a detective wandering around in Game of Thrones. And that just really works for me because those are two genres I love and you don't get to see combined that often. As the series goes on, I fully expect that these kind of big politics of the worlds are going to become much more prevalent. I think Von Volt's kind of journey to find out what has been happening with the Templars, to find out why people are able to use some of these powers that have so traditionally been the Justice's powers. All of that's very much, I think, going to become the focus of the series, but I would really love if it could do that while maybe having a mystery subplot to each book. This one, there was a little bit at the start with the religious conflict, then we followed the kind of murder mystery aspect for probably up to about the 60% of the book, and then it hit that the politics, everything that had been hinted at throughout became rushing to the foreground, and we got our big dramatic epic fantasy style siege moment. And I enjoyed all of it, but I really would like if it kept that balance in the future books. I just think it would be a really good way of doing it. I would probably be a little disappointed if it becomes too much about the overarching politics, because I find the justices and that whole kind of investigative aspect so unique and so interesting in this. We got to see Von Volt use at least 2 of the justices' powers. We see him use the Emperor's voice, which essentially compels truth and confession from suspects. And we got to see him perform necromancy, where he was able to interrogate someone that had already died. But we also do get mentions that some of the justices have other powers. We see someone that is able to essentially warg into animals, and we hear mention of levitation and some other kind of really out there powers. I think it would be really interesting to find out whether are these powers a little bit like X-Men, that you get what you get, or are they something that you can kind of aspire to with the more you learn. Potentially, could Von Volt learn these new powers, and how would they aid him in his investigative journeys? I just think it opens up a really interesting aspect to that kind of you see often in maybe urban fantasies, things like the Dresden Files, where you have wizards investigating crimes and you see how the magic can be useful to the investigations. I think if you could see some of that in this series as we continue, that would also be really interesting. You do get to see a bit of it in this book, but I would like more. For me, the book really kicked off round about the halfway mark, where Helena, who has been our POV character throughout, really comes into her own. In the first half of the book, she is telling you Von Volt's story. We do see some conflict between her and her mentor. We see them disagree over some of their strategies, over some of his choices, and she does kind of float the idea that she may be leaving his service at some point in the near future. But she, for the main part, is a step back from a lot of the action. She's almost a sort of passive character, just giving us a window into Von Volt's legend, his legacy. In that middle section of the book, the two go their separate ways. Von Volt goes to learn more about the great big politics, the overarching story, the greater threat, and Helena continues the investigation into a local woman's murder by going undercover in a cloister. This is the section, I'll be honest, that really hooked me on the story. The setting was so interesting. We got to see her sneaking about in the tunnels, we got to see her rooting through various people's belongings, we got to see her testing her wits against other people there who were trying to get information out of her while she was trying to learn about them. And I just thought, as well as the setting, we got to see Helena step into her own. She becomes much more, I think, involved in the story, and the narrative becomes much more personal, much more visceral. And I think the writing connection there, it clicked a lot better. You suddenly were so much more in her head, you were so much more aware of her emotions, and you kind of then got swept along in that, more so than her slightly detached aspect she'd had before. It does actually kind of mirror, I guess, her relationship to Von Volt and her relationship to being a justice. As the story goes along, we get to see her become more invested, and it goes a lot of these issues of dealing justice and a lot of these issues of dealing with horrible things that are happening to other people at the beginning are she's sort of cordoned off from that in a little way. It's all very theoretical and it's all very academic. Despite the horrors that she sees in that kind of prologue, it's still not something that's an amazingly personal problem. And then as the book goes on and the reader gets closer to her narrative. We also see her get closer to these conflicts of justice versus vengeance, the kind of the personal toll that these things take. We get to see much more personal suffering on her part, both in physical things that she endures during the siege, things that threaten the people she cares about. And overall, I just thought it escalated the tension and the stakes really nicely. After I finished The Justice of Kings, I really didn't want to pick up another big book. The readathon is kind of getting towards the end point, and I plan on taking part in the Amazing Readathon next month, and that's one that I want to be able to kind of really give my all to. It's crazy and hectic, and prompts drop every couple of days, and you really have to be keeping up. So I don't want to have a book that I have half started. I want to be able to start something new as soon as that first prompt drops. And I also don't want to weigh myself down and feel like I'm kind of losing steam. So I wouldn't mind a quiet couple of reading days. So instead, what I have done is I've picked up some short stories, and I'm going to kind of dip in and out of those for the last couple of days of the month, and I'll let you know how I got on with them in my final update. So as I said, I decided to pick up a couple of short stories to wrap up my Mystery and Mayhem reading. And funnily enough, that's been a great choice because I think I got more points for these short stories than I did for reading Ship of Magic. The first one was The President's Brain is Missing by John Scalzi. It was very, very short, this one, and it is a kind of contemporary near future science fiction. It has a very parody-esque feel to it, kind of satire, and it sort of reminded me a little bit of something you might have seen in the X-Files. The story first came out in 2010, so it is probably not about anyone we might think it was about, but it's fascinating. It also probably says something about our culture. It was a strange one. It does exactly what it says on the tin. The premise is that the president's brain is missing and yet he's still functioning, and his staff are trying to find his brain. It has a kind of noir feel to it, as well as that satire. You have these government agencies and the double dealing, and they're trying to make connections to talk to people under the radar. There's a mention of Area 51. There's a little bit of playing around with that and the secrecy around it. We talk about maybe transporter technology being used in various ways without the public's knowledge. A lot happens in those 30 pages, and I had a really good time with that. I think Scalzi and I have reached a stage where all of the books or stories I have read by him, they always hit that kind of mid-3 range. I know I'm going to enjoy it. I don't think I'm going to love it, and that's probably where I sat with this one. I definitely love his concepts. I think they're always really interesting, and I just maybe don't get as much as I could from the execution. But I've never been a massive sci-fi fan, so I am quite happy with where this falls, and actually reading his short stories might be best for me because I'll get to have the concept without investing doodles and oodles of time reading a big chunky book. That said, I do still plan on reading the Kaiju Preservation Society really soon. The next short story is actually a novella, and that is But Not Too Bold. This was a strange one, but actually I really enjoyed it. For the page count, which I think is somewhere around the 120 mark, this made such an impact. And it's definitely one of the books that I'm going to remember most this month, which is funny because it took me a couple of hours at most to read it. This is about Delia, who works in this isolated, creepy house, and their employer lives up in the attic, and she happens to be a spider woman monster. And everyone that lives in the house's whole life is kind of dedicated to serving her. Basically, at the start of the book, the current keeper of the keys, who is Delia's direct boss, has been eaten by their employer. And Delia is next up to the plate. She has to resume the responsibilities of this job. She tries her best not to annoy Anatima, who she knows is gonna eat her. It's a kind of conclusion. She's like, eventually it's gonna happen. But she also gets given the task of finding out who has been stealing from Anatima. She thinks it was the predecessor, but now she's not so sure, and basically the whole house's lives are kind of in Delia's hands, but she has to solve this mystery. And this is just, I had such a good time with it. It's very atmospheric. There are so many food descriptions in this that when you say the spider eats the staff, you wouldn't think that you would also get a lot of food porn in it. The two things seem like they should be in conflict, but there is a lot of food porn in this that's human food and is perfectly fine. It's fine to want it. It's not like human food, like the bad type of human food. It's nice human food. There's not a huge amount of plot. We are investigating that mystery, but I would definitely say the vibes are more important than the story. It's a really lovely snapshot of a world. I think if the book was any longer, it would drag and you wouldn't have enough plot to see you through. But I would love to know more about the world that this exists in. I would love to know more about this house and the people within it. But you would need a bigger story to do that within. I think the book is perfectly sized for the story it's telling. I guess it kind of gives you a taste or a tease of this world without giving you too much. I'm still like, it leaves you wanting more, is the way to describe it. It definitely gives you this interesting setting, these interesting characters, but leaves you wanting more. It has a slightly Bluebeard vibe in it, in that yes, the staff work for Anatima, but also there are mentions of the brides that have been brought along the years. They show up, they get married, they see what they have married, and ultimately they get eaten. And then this process starts again with, I think, Anatima always hoping for the best, and it just doesn't work out. And it's really interesting because these characters that work in the house are all aware that the brides don't tend to live past the first couple of days of the marriage. And yet, you can't say they're bad people. You wouldn't say they're bad people. It's a really interesting kind of, everyone has this slightly blinkered, morally grey, willing to overlook things. That's just really interesting and fits perfectly with the idea of a world where these monsters might exist. So this was definitely a winner and a surprise, because although I was really looking forward to it, I didn't know anything about it, and I was a little disappointed. Maybe I hadn't really looked too closely when I ordered it, and I was a little disappointed when I saw how slim it was. But actually, yeah, it was perfect. It was the perfect size for what it was. And I love this cover. I think it's beautiful. So I'm glad I bought it. The next part of this vlog is going to jump into The Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. It's one I've been reading all month. I've moved this kind of section all to the end of the vlog, so if you're not interested in Ship of Magic, it hasn't been scattered throughout the past 3 weeks. If you don't want to stick around for it, I totally understand. But do let me know if you would like to talk about any of the other books I've mentioned in the comments. So I have hit the 300-ish page mark on Ship of Magic, and in my copy that takes me to about a third. It's been a bit slow going. I struggled to get started. My plan was to read a couple of pages, probably more like 30 or 40 pages every day for the entire month, and just kind of work steadily through it over the course of Wyrd and Wonder. But I got to, I think, the 10th of May and I still hadn't picked it up, and I just knew that that wasn't going to work. I think the problem is it's intimidating, and it just kept putting me off a bit because I know the pacing and I just wasn't excited to read it, even though I really want to, which is a really odd feeling. But I ended up sitting with the book, and I had an afternoon and I got through the first 150 pages. That might be the way I have to keep tackling it, is to kind of sit down and read it in decent sized chunks, 100 pages or something similar to that, rather than thinking that 30 pages at a time would be enough. The chapters are really big, and I think 30 pages would probably only give me a scene or maybe a couple of scenes, whereas I really need to sink into these characters and get at least a few chapters at a time done to keep it moving in my head. Because what I have read I've really enjoyed. So we have Kenneth, who is a pirate, and he wants to be the king of the pirates. His kind of intermediary goal is that he wants a live ship of his own. The live ships are made of wizard wood, and once enough family members of the family that owns the boat die on the ship, they kind of quicken and come to life, and they're nigh unstoppable. The pirates don't go after them because the ships are just so fast. The ships can almost sail themselves. And Kenneth's thought is that if he, a pirate, owned a live ship, he would just be unstoppable, and they could kind of create an industry of shepherding merchant ships through this dangerous strait of water. He essentially wants to create a business out of piracy. That's how he's going to legitimize himself, and that's how he's going to become this kind of kingly figure. At the moment, he and his first mate have just decided on a deal where the first mate will support him and, pretend enthusiasm for going off after these live ships as they come across them, because he doesn't think one can be caught. And in return, for every live ship they chase, Kenneth will let them chase after a slave ship and free the slaves that are on it. The next kind of plot line is, at the moment, has just split off. The main one is Althea. Her father's just died. The ship has been passed to her brother-in-law, and he is just a prick that has essentially told her that she's to go and make a good marriage and she's having nothing to do with the ship anymore, and just to be a good little woman and do as she's told. So Althea has told them to shove it, and she has went off on her own, and at the moment she's looking for maybe some kind of work on another ship. She thinks if she can prove that she's a good sailor on her own, then she might have a legal kind of recourse to claim the family's live ship off of her brother-in-law Kyle. Kyle is the kind of that third plot line. He is currently the owner of the Vivica, the family's live ship, and he is manipulating everyone he can to keep this ship. He has called his son, who they sent off to be a priest 4 years ago. He's called him back into the fold because the live ship needs a member of the bloodline to be aboard. So he's kind of forced this boy to come back. He doesn't want to, and we're kind of going from there. So there are a lot of characters to get a hold of. There are a lot of characters with a lot of different motivations. Hobb has done a great job of giving people both kind of immediate goals and long-term goals and stages in between. She can make sure that you're aware of all the things they might need to do in between to get there and what they would be willing to do. There are a lot of plot lines happening, and there are a lot of things weaving together. It has that very epic fantasy thing of these characters have all been kind of placed on the board, and they all do have kind of trajectories, but where those trajectories overlap and interlock is still very much up for grabs. I personally am really enjoying Althea as a character. She, if anything, is maybe a little simplistic in the sense of she's very driven, she's very focused, she doesn't have a lot of complicated or mercurial feelings the way some of the other characters do, and I'm just really enjoying her as a protagonist. Kyle is the bane of my existence, Althea's brother-in-law, and he's been the captain of the ship for the past year, but now that the family patriarch has died, he's been also given the kind of ownership of the ship by his wife, and he has been made the kind of de facto leader of the entire family. Everyone now falls under him, and I hate him so much. And partly it's the fact I think that his name is Kyle, and everyone else has these kind of fantasy names that are either fantasy names in the sense of names that you've never really heard of in our world, or fantasy names in the sense that they're kind of old-fashioned names in our world, and they kind of fit in that historical-esque fantasy vibe. And then you have Kyle, who both by name and personality sounds like he should be middle management in some general big box grocery store, and the kind of guy that micromanages a kid's soccer team and then goes home and just drinks on the sofa all night. He annoys me a lot. And I just kind of want to smack him about because he's just so arrogant in the hypocrisy, and he annoys me. And I really hope that he gets eaten by sea serpents. Most of the cast, I will be honest, it's not that I don't care what happens to them, but I kind of don't care what happens to them. I'd be sad for them if they died, but I don't have a huge emotional connection to them. Whereas Kyle I actively dislike, and he sets my teeth on edge every time he appears on the page. I don't know if he's meant to be coming across as the big villain of the piece. I feel like Kenneth is supposed to be the villain. He is a pirate. He wants to be the pirate king. He's very ambitious. In the opening chapter where we saw him, he was very kind of shady. Yet Kyle feels more like the villain to me, but it's in that very mundane, just he's patriarch of a family that kind of cedes all control to him. He's incredibly sexist, and he's such a controlling dick. And I feel like he is the bigger villain, and I don't know whether that is intentional, that he is the bad guy, or whether that's just my reading of it, or whether this is something that maybe has changed. This book came out a long time ago, and I don't know whether that's something that maybe he wouldn't have read as such a villain if you were reading this in the 90s as reading it in 2025. I don't know. But it is interesting. I also find it really interesting to see how it will play out in the longer sense that Kenneth, who is our bad guy, is currently being the slaves. Whereas Kyle, who is nominally on our kind of good guy family team, has just decided that to protect the family's finances, he's willing to take the most valuable cargo, despite his wife and mother-in-law's objections. I mean, they objected, but they didn't object too hard. So I'm kind of counting them all under this banner that the three of them have essentially decided to trade in slaves because it's valuable. And I find it kind of interesting that we have our bad guys are freeing people while our kind guys are participating in this slave trade. Are we going to see those moral choices come through? I don't think it's necessarily a moral stance on Kenneth's part. He only agrees to rescue these slaves off the slave ships because it is the condition his first mate puts on his support of Kenneth's search for a live ship to claim for himself. But I wonder whether maybe we will see that factor in any way, whether there'll be a kind of moving of these moral lines, or whether different things will pull one of the kind of sides one way or the other. It's a very long book and there's a lot going on in it, and lots of different kind of potential plot lines and paths that could be followed. There's lots of hints been dropped, there's lots of characters mentioned, lots of places ominously referred to, and I'm very intrigued to see where Hobb is going to take this. I had some clips recorded of my thoughts about Ship of Magic as I went along, but I had some problems with my phone or with my computer, I don't know which, and the files have been corrupted. So instead you'll just get my kind of thoughts right now, having reached the end. It took me a while to settle. The idea of doing it a small amount of pages every single day was a great idea, but ultimately it just didn't work for me. I had to read this book in chunks, in kind of 100-page increments, because I really needed that to settle into the depth of the world building. There are just so many characters and there's so much going on in the world that reading a couple of pages, it's too disjointed and I was struggling to connect with anything. Once I started reading it in bigger sections, it became so much smoother and such a better reading experience. And that's not to say that I was struggling with the book itself at any point. When I sat down to read it, and I sat down to read say 100 pages, that time just flew in. And I would be at the end of that section before I knew it. I was really invested, so it wasn't a struggle. it was just a different experience than I expected. I also find it interesting that the characters I thought I would really come to love. I thought Kenneth, who is the wannabe pirate king, and Althea, who is the plucky young heroine, were going to be my favourites. And while I didn't dislike them, Kyle I violently disliked. While I didn't dislike them, I also didn't I didn't fall for them the way I thought I would. The character that I most wanted success for was actually one of the live ships, Paragon. He has a really tragic backstory, and I really hope in the future books that things are going to work out for him. Similarly, or the flip side of that, Kyle suffers. I'm not saying he doesn't. All the characters obviously have their moments of suffering, but I did want to see Kyle get eaten. I wanted to see him suffer more. He was a really good character to hate though. In the Discord, someone pointed out that he actually really doesn't get any points of view. There's one towards the end, but we see him through other people's eyes. And I do wonder whether that was a choice Hobb made so that we wouldn't sympathise with him to the same degree, or whether because his thinking is so black and white, he's so unwilling to compromise, and he is leaning into slavery because it is the simplest, most profitable way he can think of to bring up the family fortunes. I wonder whether being in his head, if anything, might make him less sympathetic, and whether there were choices that were made there. Interestingly enough, in this last section, I would say we have 3 characters that come to the fore in addition to the main cast we started with. And actually, they might be the 3 most interesting characters, apart from my baby Paragon. Yes, Althea, Winslow, Kenneth are the main characters, and they start out strong and they continue throughout. But each of them introduce us to a character somewhere along the way that seems relatively minor, but in this last section I think showed real promise for future books. We have one of the prostitutes that Kenneth meets in one of the towns and eventually takes aboard his ship. She shows true ruthlessness. I think that her dedication to Kenneth, combined with that kind of real core of steel, is going to be really fascinating as the books go on, and we see either what she would do to protect him or what she would do to protect their relationship from outside forces. At the moment they are getting along relatively well, but I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens if the two of them come into conflict. We also meet Amber, who is a woodworker, and she briefly features in Althea's storyline and then becomes more involved with Paragon. We get some really nice hints of her having some kind of mysterious past, some goals that we don't know about. She is one of the few characters that has taken the time to get to know the ship and that wants to help him. Whether all that comes to pass will be really interesting. I have my fingers crossed there. Then the last character that really I felt came to the fore and became more interesting than they were kind of hinted to be at the beginning was Malta Vestrit. She is Kyle's daughter and part of the main family. They're the owners of the live ship that has just quickened and the ones that we are kind of following. She's Winslow's sister. She's left at home at port with her mother and grandmother, and for most of the book we are watching these 3 women as they try in various ways and to various degrees butt heads, as they each have their own opinions on what the family needs to do to secure its success and its future. And Malta reminds me so much of Lydia Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. She's 13, she wants to be presented as a woman, she wants to go to parties, she wants pretty dresses, she doesn't see why the family should have to make cutbacks when they could simply take these riskier trading routes or start carrying slaves the way her father suggested. She doesn't see why they have to stick to kind of stodgy old traditions that her grandmother is really pushing that the family needs to respect. And she sets herself up a little bit in that she accidentally accepts a courtship proposal from one of the wild traders. And I think that is going to be a big plot point going forward. We've not heard much about the Rainwild traders in this book other than that the Rainwild River is incredibly dangerous. Trade there is very profitable because of the magical items you can bring back, but that Veronica's husband has always said that it is not worth the danger. And then the people that come from there to visit are presented as almost kind of magical. They have kind of physical deformities, but there's a lot of respect given to them, and I think it'd be really interesting to see how Malta evolves as a character if she has to learn more about these people. It definitely seems like something that would be in conflict with quite the kind of flighty, shallow character she's being presented as, to have to go into these isolated wilds and maybe have to learn to become more focused on survival or more focused on things that really matter rather than appearances. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. Looking back on it a few days later, the depth of the characters and the depth of the world building and the way Hobb writes are just all really, really well done. There's never any kind of scenes that feel like overwritten. There's never any kind of melodrama in the characters' emotions, but you gradually, it kind of creeps up on you, and you, through the immersion of it, come to know the characters, come to care about them without any kind of shallow tricks to tug on your heartstrings. That being said though, I also don't know that apart from Paragon, there was any character in here that I was massively attached to. The character that inspired the most emotion in me was Kyle, because I despised him. And maybe Malta, because she did irritate me and frustrated me, especially towards the end, but she's 13. So I wouldn't say it was hateful. Kyle, it was hateful. But I don't know that I got that other end of the spectrum. I don't know that there were any characters that I was really rooting for. And I'm just not sure if I'm going to continue the series. My copy of this book was about 900 pages. And obviously if it had been half of that, then there wouldn't have been the same depth, there wouldn't have been the same level of vastness in the world. But if the books, if you could distill it all down, if they were shorter, then I would be far more willing to be like, you know what, I started the trilogy, I tend to be a completionist, I will at the very least finish this trilogy, even if that's the only realm of the Elderling books I do continue with. I definitely think that this series, based on this first book, would be much more to my taste than the Assassin's Apprentice books. I read the first one in that series as well and I didn't continue it, but this one definitely feels more like my thing. I just think another almost 1,000-page book is a big time commitment, a big effort commitment, and I'm not sure that this book, I was so passionate about it that I want to make that commitment. I am really curious about where a lot of the characters end up, but I just don't know if I'm that curious. And I think if I'd felt a stronger connection to any particular character, the interest would be enough to see me through another book, but without that emotional connection, I'm not sure the interest is. So I'm gonna have to think about that and decide whether I want to continue the series. I think if I decide to continue the series, then I will have to do it relatively soon, because otherwise I'm going to lose track of all these little details within all the different characters, and I don't think that would be giving it a fair shot either. So it is something I will have to think about and make a decision on, but at the moment I'm leaning more towards, I think, no than yes. But I will also have to see how the discussion of the kind of this buddy read goes in the group chat, because I have been really enjoying seeing what the other Wyrd and Wonder participants thought as we went through it, and they've had some really good insights. So it might be that by the time other people get to the end as well and I can read those, it might just spark something in me that makes me, either I'll appreciate something in this book more, or they'll pose some kind of question that really does spark that interest and I'll want to read the next book. But until then, I just have to wait and see. If you've got to this stage of the vlog, I am really happy, and I want to thank you so much for sticking around, because I know this has been quite a rambling one. If you have read any of the Robin Hobb books, please let me know in the comments. Let me know whether, would you, having read this book and kind of sitting where I'm sitting with it, would you continue the series? Let me know what you think. If you haven't read any of the books in this vlog, either Ship of Magic or Justice of Kings, then just leave me some kind of boat emoji for this last week of Wyrd and Wonder. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next vlog. Goodbye.